This is a video about One Piece. Specifically, whether One Piece is good. When I began writing this script in January of 2025, I did not have an answer to this question. I did not know what my answer would be, or what I would argue for. So much of this video will not be an argument, but instead the details of an attempt to take the question seriously, and the considerations I believe worth bringing to bear on it. In some ways, I still don't have an answer to this question. While this video is not a ramble, those who are able to sit through its 2-hour runtime without knowing where they will wind up at the end have both my admiration and my gratitude. Though, if you are able to make it to the end, I hope to have made the journey there worthwhile. This video will be somewhat academic in tone. To a certain extent, this is unavoidable with respect to the way I would like to approach the topic. But it is also, regrettably, the style which comes most naturally to me, and if I were to attempt a more YouTube-friendly tone, the video would be so egregiously delayed that it would become publishable only after One Piece itself came to an end, at which point I would have to start over anyway. So let's begin. If you want to call a thing good, you first have to understand what it is. It doesn't make sense to call a horse a bad horse because it does not growl or have claws, or because it guards private property very poorly. These are criteria we would use to judge, for example, the goodness of a dog. I do not think that One Piece is a dog, but it might still be a horse. That said, I think it makes the most sense, if we are taking the matter seriously, to consider it as a work of art, broadly speaking. This, I take it, is what most people have in mind anyway when they claim that One Piece, or any other piece of media, is good. But when we pose the question in this way, we run into a similar version of the same problem. There are all sorts of art, and it doesn't make much sense to critique One Piece on the standards of sculpture. On the other hand, it seems too limited to constrain ourselves to the question of whether One Piece is a good shonen or a good fiction series. Shonen and fiction could simply be crappy genres of art, with a few exceptions standing out amid a mountain of half-baked garbage designed for overworked consumers with an insatiable appetite for junk food. The goodness of these exceptions would have nothing to do with their categorization in the genre. The very opposite. Their goodness would be all the more remarkable because of it. So instead of engaging in a hopeless game of who's that Pokemon, I think it would benefit us to push the analysis in a different direction, and to play with the idea that there are two kinds of art. Okay, you'll say, that seems like a bit of an oversimplification. And you're right, of course. We can analyze the world of the artwork however we like. There is modern and pre-modern art, high and low art, poetry and sculpture, painting and music, etc., etc. Usually, when dividing up the world of art, we divide it according to artistic medium or era. We're not going to do that. Instead, we're going to split the world of art into two worlds, based on what effect each world produces in the audience. If we're just playing with this idea, we can be a little bit more speculative, maybe oversimplifying here and making things overly complex there. Which isn't to say that we can't play seriously, but we'll only find out if we've made a serious error after following the ideas where they lead. The first kind of art reveals a deep truth. Maybe the truth is about us or about the world. Maybe it is about our place in the world or with each other. Either way, it will be something that is not easy to access, something that we somehow need help to get to. The first kind of art helps us get there. It doesn't teach us anything in the sense that it lays out a series of arguments and facts. but we are nevertheless exposed to something which we find impossible to access otherwise. The characters, speeches, and images are so many masks from out of which the truth speaks. The second kind of art gives us feelings. It pulls our heartstrings and makes us cry. It can overwhelm and devastate us, or energize and motivate us. We identify with the heroes and see ourselves reflected in them, if maybe in an exaggerated fashion. So when the hero is crushed, we feel ourselves crushed. When the hero succeeds, we feel ourselves succeeding. When the hero loves, we feel ourselves in love. The second kind of art is also popular. We feel good when we feel in love, or successful, or like we've overcome an obstacle. A good book of this second sort is the book that gives the most feelings to the most people. It aims to give these feelings, and its ability to do so is its standard of success. The feeling might come to the reader uninvited, but the feeling's casual disregard for decorum is part of its charm, and what you do with the feeling is up to you. You can always kick it out when it becomes a nuisance. Because of this control, it even feels good to feel sad, so long as the newly initiated depressive can return at a moment's notice to filing her taxes. The second kind of art fits nicely into a world with taxes to file, and so is popular. The second kind of art can be criticized by everyone and no one. Everyone because everyone has feelings. No one because no one's feelings are accessible to anyone else. Criticism of the second kind of art is never productive, because the most two people can do with respect to a work of art is agree that they felt the same things. On the other hand, disagreement is extremely vicious. If I was not moved to tears by a work and claimed that it is bad, but you sobbed for hours, we enter a nightmare. If the work is bad, you ought not to have felt something from it, because the standard for goodness is how much it makes you feel, and I felt nothing. But feelings were exactly what you were after when you picked it up at the bookstore, and you did in fact receive them. So the work was good. So after screaming at each other for several hours about the characters and the plot, we finally agree, exhausted, that it's all just subjective. Because the second kind of art is like the air we breathe, and because we are so emotionally invested in the goodness of the things we like, this very emotional investment signifying the goodness itself, the first kind of art is forgotten. After it is forgotten, it becomes very important that it never reappears. If there were a kind of art whose purpose was not primarily to produce feelings, and we accordingly faced such a work without the feelings which we take to indicate goodness, but this work of art claimed nevertheless to be good, all of our previous encounters with art would be put into question. Which is to say, our feelings would be put into question, and these we consider both to be outside of our control and representative of our deepest being. But the first kind of art, because it reveals a deep truth, is exactly the sort which claims to be, somehow, objectively good. If it were not obvious, the first kind of art stands in generally for what is called fine art. The second designates consumer art, art designed for mass public consumption. These distinctions also resemble two general approaches to understanding the purpose of art. The first, in the tradition of Kant, understands fine art as the sort of thing which ought to instill in the viewer a disinterested pleasure, a pleasure which is contemplative. Art galleries, for instance, are structured on this principle, which is why their visitors often look quite bored. The second approach, in the tradition of Aristotle, understands the world of art in terms of the feeling which the artwork produces in the audience. Different forms of artwork will produce different kinds of feelings. The mark of tragedy for Aristotle is its production and subsequent purging of the feelings of fear and pity. Coincidentally, in his aesthetic theory, Kant seems to understand the aesthetic experience as one which is basically private. Even if the experience of beauty, on his view, must be universally communicable, his examples are relentlessly solitary. Walking through a forest, observing a rose, beholding a painting. Aristotle, on the other hand, has in mind artworks that are designed for public consumption. The performance of tragedy in Athens was a contest between the poets. However, there are certain ways in which what we have called the first kind of art and the second do not precisely mirror these two approaches. Importantly, I have articulated the first kind of art as the sort of thing which reveals a deep truth, or set of truths. This would be too broad for Kant, for whom beauty can disclose a rational human being's moral vocation, but not necessarily something like deep truths in general. I only mention this correspondence in order to show that I'm not just making things up to suit a conclusion about one piece which I have already reached. Like I said, I remain undecided with respect to One Piece's goodness. And ultimately, the strength of any distinction like that drawn here will not be found in its intellectual heritage, as glamorous as that might be, but in the results it is able to produce in the analysis. Many people would not call the second kind of art at all. But it is the air we breathe, and like it or not, it is that from which most of us end up drawing our standards and expectations in the aesthetic sphere. Obviously, the boundaries are not always clear. Some artworks exist in both worlds. The works of Shakespeare were tremendously popular in their own time, especially among so-called commoners, and the Athenian tragic festivals drew spectators from all over ancient Greece. Fine art can, of course, produce emotions. But it also does something special in contradistinction to art which only produces emotions, and which can only appeal to feelings as its sole standard. Drawing the distinction in this way allows us to preserve the validity of an audience member's feelings with respect to consumer art, while keeping open the possibility that there exists another kind of art, qualitatively different, which aspires to an objective standard. Your feelings remain valid, even if you find yourself weeping over Desperate Housewives. My question ultimately is whether One Piece can be considered of this first, higher kind of art, the kind which reveals a deep truth, without ignoring its unmatched ability to bring its audience to tears, or confusing that ability for an objective standard of its goodness. Or, what amounts to the opposite, taking One Piece's ability to produce feelings as an indication that it is in fact not an artwork of the good sort, of the first sort. One Piece could be the rare sort of work that exists comfortably in both worlds. But then, what does it mean for art to reveal a deep truth? I want to attempt to illustrate what I mean through an example from Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. Pride and Prejudice is another of those rare works whose place in the literary canon is more or less assured, while remaining tremendously popular. The moment I have in mind is specifically Darcy's letter. The setup goes something like this. Darcy, a man of great wealth and pride, has confessed his love for Elizabeth the previous night. She turns him down without hesitation. Darcy, on the other hand, expected an easy yes, much less outright refusal. He storms out of her house, embarrassed. The next day, he confronts her during her morning walk, shoves a letter into her hand, and hustles away. The letter is bizarre, and Elizabeth initially reads it with revulsion. But eventually she comes around to seeing his side of things, and, after learning more about him in the following chapters, falls in love with him. This is an oversimplification which would bar me from any professorial post in English literature, but that is the general structure of the narrative. What is the deep truth here? That love is difficult? Of course, but we don't need Pride and Prejudice to tell us that. It's common knowledge that love is hard, that love requires vulnerability, and that somebody has to risk looking like an idiot for anything to come of it at all. This is all common knowledge. So does fine art merely serve to remind intellectual snobs of things they already know? Of things they could just as easily be reminded of by reading Naruto if only they weren't so arrogant? Consumers of self-help literature often tout this as precisely its utility. They know they aren't getting anything new or profound in the latest Tony Robbins book, but, so they say, it is easy to forget the simple things in the hustle and bustle of daily life. So is it that fine art is self-help for snobs, telling them things they already know? I don't think so. If we look at the case of Darcy's letter, we find that the very opposite is the case. Here's the first paragraph. Oh boy. Be not alarmed, madam, on receiving this letter, by the apprehension of its containing any repetition of those sentiments, or renewal of those offers which were last night so disgusting to you. I write without any intention of paining you, or humbling myself, by dwelling on wishes which, for the happiness of both, cannot be too soon forgotten. And the effort which the formation and the perusal of this letter must occasion should have been spared had not my character required it to be written and read. You must, therefore, pardon the freedom with which I demand your attention. Your feelings, I know, will bestow it unwillingly, but I demand it of your justice. We begin with 1,000 red flags. The letter, which is several pages long, continues by clarifying everything with respect to Darcy's relationship to Elizabeth's family that he believes she has misunderstood. Are these the cringe texts after a bad date? But ultimately, Elizabeth requites his love. She even begins to come around to some of the things he says on her first read-through. This doesn't fit the model of what we would expect at all. What romance ought to look like and what it means to fall in love are put into question. We don't have the time to get fully to the bottom of this. Even if we did, it is beyond my powers and knowledge of the work to do so. But I would like to suggest that Darcy's letter demonstrates something like this. The vulnerability to deliver oneself over to the beloved's court of justice, but also the courage and healthy pride to hold fast to one's self-regard in the courtroom, to resist at all costs attempting to persuade the judge by manipulative means to solicit a more favorable verdict. When one bribes the judge in the court of love, no one wins. Elizabeth begins to reciprocate because these are not the manipulative barbs of a confused loser who did not get what he wanted, but rather demonstrate a healthy, if sometimes overweening, pride, and a desire that the truth come to light. Both of these qualities, as it happens, are not entirely foreign to Elizabeth's own character. To make sense of the unexpected outcome of Darcy's letter, we would have to look at the complicated constellation of who these people are, what dispositions they have, what they care about, what motivates them, and so on. But maybe making sense of it isn't so much the point at all. Maybe the point is that love is precisely the sort of thing that cannot be reduced to an algebra of past experiences and personality traits. We should not conclude from Darcy's ultimate success that every spurned lover ought to write 5-page letters. Our expectations are not met, they are challenged. This more complicated, perplexing story shows the simple truth that love is hard, but in a way which is somehow truer to the real phenomenon of love. Confessions of love in the second kind of art typically go exactly the way we expect, and in doing so hit all the emotional beats that we want from these scenes. Hinata pulls our heartstrings, and everyone goes home happy. Maybe after watching this scene, someone even plucks up the courage to ask out their crush. That's fine. But that person, if they're successful, will inevitably discover that genuine love, when it is lived, cannot be leveled down into a trope or a catchphrase. Though I hope it goes well for them, nerds need love too. Another way of putting this is that art of the first sort does not make so-called simple truths more accessible. Instead, it makes them more difficult, and in so doing makes them more true. Truth isn't simple. The first kind of art challenges, the second affirms. The first complexifies and makes more difficult. The second simplifies and makes easy. Nor, I think, is this coincidental to the second kind of art's ability to produce feelings. An audience which is perplexed or in a contemplative mood is more difficult to yank around emotionally. We've spent a lot of time in some murky theoretical waters. Let's come up for air. Why are we even bothering to ask the question in this way? And why the circuitous way of attempting to answer it? Because, I believe, there is a certain risk in the two most common approaches to analyzing the goodness of One Piece, or for that matter, of any popular media. This is not to say that they are bad approaches, but only to say that they are risky. What these approaches are, and why they are risky, I think will be best demonstrated with a caricature of the typical consumer of popular Japanese media. So let's average together the qualities and traits of the typical anime fan and see what makes him tick. He's average height and a little overweight. He showers occasionally, about twice a week, and shaves just as often. His last haircut was 7 months ago. He always has it cut short, but doesn't care if it grows past his ears. He's clever. He never did much homework in elementary school, but he also didn't need to. This bad habit continued into high school, but he was never punished with more than a couple C's. He got into college without much difficulty, a decent state school. He was always a little weird, and his friends were also, inevitably, a little weird too. Their weird little group liked weird little things, and there was something delightful and dramatic going on in the Saturday morning shows featuring giant-eyed heroes and villains. Something which somehow wasn't replicated in the normal cartoons. This was anime, and they fell in love. Growing older, his love of the genre became paradoxical. On the one hand, it was a mark of distinction, membership in a select group of weird little people who like weird little things. A way to be different from the normies, with whom he never had much in common anyway. But it also became a secret shame. There is something charming when a weird person's weirdness manifests in a hobby like rock collecting or painting model trains. But something seems to have gone wrong if you're still watching cartoons for children in your 20s. And our anime fan was always one of the smart ones. Shouldn't he have become passionate about organic chemistry or Shakespeare? Somehow he has to overcome this shame. He can't live with himself if what he likes isn't good or deep. He feels the need to justify himself to himself. He needs to believe that what he likes is good, so that it fit with his own self-image. But for him to take this belief seriously, he needs some sort of standard. After all, to toddlers, Teletubbies may as well be King Lear. So he looks around for works which are more universally acknowledged as good and deep, to which he can connect his favorite shows. And this is what he finds in the genre of popular philosophy. If you can hook up your shonen battle manga to a famous philosopher or work of literature, you can sponge off that work's established legitimacy. Our anime fan might feel insecure that his interests are childish, but if those interests express Kantian themes, or Aristotle's theory of virtue, or demonstrate parallels to The Great Gatsby, that's a whole different story. But something quickly goes wrong. This might satisfy his desire to legitimate his interests for a moment, but he is a smart guy. He knows that something is amiss. Philosophical themes, if sufficiently generalized, are definitionally ubiquitous. Questions of right versus wrong, selfishness versus altruism, independence versus dependence. Far from signifying a work's unique quality, it is more difficult to imagine a story that doesn't deal with these issues. If Kant's categorical imperative is turned into the golden rule, you can find it anywhere, from One Piece to the Odyssey to Clifford the Big Red Dog. The best efforts in popular philosophy resemble a careful exercise in pattern matching. Rather than erasing all the lines so as to fit one blank square on top of another, the philosophical idea is carefully chosen for its unique texture, which finds itself already sketched out in the unique design of the work. But for any of this to function, the work in question must already possess the contouring required to resemble the complexity of the philosophical idea in its original form. In other words, the work must already, in a certain sense, be understood and grasped as good indeed. Otherwise, the efforts to draw parallels with a work of philosophy or great literature is an exercise in finger painting. But the goodness and deepness of the work were exactly what we were trying to prove by means of connecting them with philosophy and literature. We made the conclusion we wanted the condition for reaching it. So instead, it seems like it's necessary to understand the goodness and depth of a work on its own terms first, in order to draw any worthwhile parallels at all. What are these terms? Now our anime fan arrives at the beginning of this video. Obviously, his favorite anime is not a horse or a piece of sculpture. But nor is it just a shonen or just a fantasy. These are genres which he feels ashamed of, and which he feels the need to justify to himself. He needs to categorize his love under something greater, that is, according to the criteria of goodness allotted to capital L literature itself. The terms he is looking for are the terms of literary criticism, and he arrives at the method of literary analysis. Before, he tried connecting his love with great works of philosophy and literature by identifying general similarities. Now he will attempt to analyze his love according to the same standards those great works themselves are subject to. And this is why I felt it necessary to introduce the two worlds of art at the beginning. Because at this point, the path branches. One path leads to the world of popular literary analysis as it is usually conducted. The other path leads to whatever this video is. Nothing is wrong, of course, with popular literary analysis. For that matter, nothing is wrong with popular philosophy. Both can be done well and both can be done poorly. When it is done well, the result is often enlightening and, frankly, a lot of fun. A certain breathlessness accompanies watching one's favorite book put on the dissection table, and seeing each tiny piece of the work explained with respect to its purpose in the whole. It is always fun to learn what makes something tick, and why you came to fall in love with it, even if you weren't aware of all the details at the time. But this is the source of both the joy and the danger. To learn what makes something tick presumes that it ought to do something. That is, it ought to tick. What is the ticking of popular media? We have made the case that it is the production of feelings. The apparatus of popular literary analysis is designed to explain this production. Why we like X character, why Y makes us cry, why Z is so funny, why we love so-and-so series. I don't have anyone in particular in mind here, this is just the structure of popular media analysis on YouTube, beyond One Piece and beyond anime generally. Usually, popular literary analysis proceeds via what we might call analysis by labeling. Analysis by labeling identifies, or labels, themes, narrative structures, and character traits in order to produce what we can call an algebra of feeling. X theme, say friendship, plus Y narrative structure, say betrayal, plus Z character trait, say indecision, equals a feeling of hopelessness. We can swap out the content of the variables to get a different feeling. If we swap out the character trait of indecision with the character trait of resoluteness, we get a more inspiring feeling. This can all be very interesting. And once again, this mode of analysis proceeds in the tradition inaugurated by Aristotle in the Poetics, where tragedy is understood in terms of the effect it produces in the audience, the production and purging of fear and pity, and what aspects of plot structure and characterization lead to this sort of feeling being brought about. For example, a tragedy for Aristotle cannot display bad things happening to bad people. This, according to Aristotle, is something we find funny, and is the domain of comedy. But a tragedy also cannot display bad things happening to good people. We would find that merely repulsive and repugnant. Instead, a tragedy ought to display bad things happening to people who are somewhere in the middle, people who are in certain senses good and in certain senses bad. Similarly, because popular literary analysis is designed to explain the audience's feeling of love, sorrow, or inspiration, it engages with the work of art as the sort of thing designed to provoke feelings. Through this mode of analysis, our anime fan finds his feelings explained, and therefore justified. With the algebra of feeling, he can offer reasons for his emotional response to the work. If he stays in this little world, the little world of popular media analysis, he can rest satisfied. But everything falls apart as soon as he leaves it. Imagine for a moment that our anime fan, convinced of the quality of his favorite show, One Piece, persuades a friend to read the manga. This friend took a different path in cultivating his interests. While he too enjoyed his Saturday morning cartoons as a child, he encountered a bizarre history teacher in middle school who introduced him to 17th century French theater. He was consumed by a love of French theater ever since. What would this theater lover think of our anime fan's favorite story? He would, quite likely, find the humorous moments stupid, the characters unsympathetic, and the sad moments hyperbolic to the point of ridiculousness. No appeal to One Piece's intricate narrative details, its majestic world building, or its bold strokes of character would convince the lover of French theater to reconsider his emotional response, or persuade him that it was not, at bottom, over-processed junk food for little kids who ought to get back to their Latin textbooks. And this reveals the basic problem with popular media analysis that emerges from a dedicated fandom. Analyst fans know what they are going to prove before they set out analyzing the work. They're going to use the analysis to justify the feelings the work gave them beforehand. The target audience for the analysis is not normies who have never watched an anime, but people who are already fans. Compare this to the literary analysis that happens in an academic setting, which usually concerns itself with the first kind of art, and which, at its best, does the opposite. Students might initially find their Oedipus or Hamlet rather boring, but over the course of the semester, as the professor unfolds ever-increasing richness and depth before their eyes, a certain few bright pupils will come to find that they have a new favorite book. But because the desire for the popular kind of media analysis that we've been talking about originates in the analyst's previous positive attitude toward the work, and not the other way around, it crumbles as soon as it meets someone who doesn't happen to share that same feeling. To reiterate something we said at the very beginning, criticism of the second kind of art is never productive, because the most two people can do with respect to a work of art is agree that they felt the same things. Finally, at the end of this path, our anime fan finds a pit of burning coals, and the last sign on the trail which reads, aesthetic nihilism. He would burn himself, and the entire world of aesthetic value, if only it meant that his interests were justified. But justified in this, that no aesthetic interests could be justified, unless he turns back to the fork in the road. One Piece's world building, its attention to detail, and its emotional rhythm have no parallel in the world of shonen manga, and maybe even in the fantasy genre as a whole. But if we want to traverse the other path, we cannot make these items essential to our analysis. I Spy books are also flush with detail, and audiences have, on occasion, been brought to tears by Adam Sandler movies. Of course, you can argue that One Piece does these things exceptionally well, and in such a way that produces the greatest magnitude of emotion among the greatest possible number of people. But we don't care about this quantitative difference. We want to know if there is a qualitative one. We want to know if One Piece can play with the big boys, if it can escape exemplarity in the second world of art and attain to even the lowest rank in the first. But can a member of the shonen genre even do this? It seems doubtful that, irrespective of its other qualities, a battle manga could ever aspire to the ranks of the first kind of art, and should instead be satisfied indulging a compliant mass of fans happy to weep and gnash their teeth. In one of his really quite delightful videos reviewing One Piece, Totally Not Mark mentioned something that seems basically right with respect to the genre. If you have found this video, I assume you are already familiar with his. If not, there will be a link. His observation went something like this: that shonen is the genre where narrative and character development happen through fights. But if that is the case, what sort of deep truth can we expect to be revealed here? The genre seems designed to oversimplify and distort. Oversimplify because every problem is solved in the same way, by fighting. Distort because punching someone in the face is rarely the way anything happens in the life we live and share on this earth. Even in situations when fighting is both necessary and matters, these situations are wars. There are no individuals with magical rubber powers or inherited ninja eye techniques to turn the tide of battle at the last second. If it is only the super-powered individual who matters, we see nothing of the boring, brutal truth and tragedy of war. In One Piece, after a certain point, it's not clear why the Marines even bother recruiting from the general population. If, during the Whitebeard War arc, every foot soldier below the rank of Commodore disappeared, it wouldn't make a lick of a difference. It wouldn't even matter if they all switched sides. And the same can be said of every foot soldier in every shonen battle manga. At a certain level, this is all just imagination, savior complex fantasyland stuff of the lowest common denominator. Take a look through the literary canon, through the best and most renowned works of world literature. You will find nothing like this. Sure, you'll find the odd fight here and there, but these are rare on purpose. The worlds described in these works are those, like ours, in which fighting is a last resort, not the only resort. The risk of death in these works bestows significance on the surrounding circumstances, a significance which is entirely lost if battle, rather being the exception, constitutes the driving force of the narrative. There is one exception, and it might just be the oldest work in the canon. The Iliad is weird. Most named characters are inconsequential, and are killed by a hero like Achilles or Hector shortly after being mentioned. They exist, essentially, to build up hype for the heroes before they eventually encounter one another one-on-one in combat. In addition, the backstories of the most significant characters are often given in the heat of battle. About half of the poem is dedicated to gory depictions of combat, of the back-and-forth movement of the Trojan and Greek armies across the plains of Troy. This passage is typical. Drawing his sword with the silver nails, the son of Atreus sprang at Paisandros, who underneath his shield's cover gripped his beautiful axe with strong bronze blade upon a long polished axe handle of olive wood. They made their strokes at the same time, and Paisandros chopped at the horn of the helmet, crested with horsehair at the very peak. Menelaus struck him as he came onward in the forehead over the base of the nose, and smashed the bones so that both eyes dropped, bloody, and lay in the dust at his feet before him. He fell, curling, and Menelaus, setting his heel upon his chest, stripped off his armor and spoke exulting over him. So I think, shall you leave the ships of the fast-mounted Danaans, you haughty Trojans, never to be glutted with the grim war noises, nor go short of all that other shame and defilement wherewith you defiled me, wretched dogs, and your hearts knew no fear, at all of the hard anger of Zeus loud thundering, the guest's god who some day will utterly sack your steep city. This encounter is the first and only time that Paisandros is mentioned. But the poem is also often and unexpectedly hilarious. The interactions of the gods are just as much comic interludes between brutal moments of battle as they are plot developments which move the story along. There is a moment, for example, when Hera attempts to seduce Zeus to distract him, in order that Poseidon might intervene on the side of the Greek forces. Zeus, to this point, has been supporting the Trojans. Zeus falls for the seduction, of course, but rather than getting right down to business, he instead decides to list off his many sexual exploits first, to Hera's face, so that he might demonstrate the depth of his arousal. For never before has love for any goddess or woman so melted about the heart inside me, broken it to submission as now. Not that time when I loved the wife of Ixion, who bore me Perithous, equal of the gods in council, nor when I loved Acrisios' daughter, sweet-stepping Danae, who bore Perseus to me, preeminent among all men, nor when I loved the daughter of far-renowned Poynix, Europa, who bore Minos to me, and Rhadamanthus the godlike, not when I loved Semele or Alcmene in Thebe, when Alcmene bore me a son, Heracles the strong-hearted, while Semele's son was Dionysus, the pleasure of mortals, not when I loved the Queen Demeter of the lovely tresses, not when it was glorious Leto, nor yourself, so much as now I love you, and the sweet passion has taken hold of me. We can only imagine the look on Hera's face. In these respects, One Piece is really closer to the Iliad than to the Odyssey, which deals primarily with the sorrowful fate of Odysseus' household during his absence. To those who haven't read the Odyssey, it may come as a surprise that the description of Odysseus' magical adventures across the Mediterranean is only about 15% of the poem, books 9 to 12. Similarly, if you have not read the Iliad, you might even be surprised to learn that there is no Trojan horse in the narrative. The poem ends with the death and burial of the Trojan hero Hector. Achilles has not yet been killed by Hector's brother Paris, and the war is certainly not yet over when the poem ends. In other words, these works are probably not what you would have been led to expect, and are much stranger and more interesting than you might have been led to believe, and I highly recommend taking the time to read them. All of this is to say, if shonen is the genre in which narrative and character development happen through fights, this ought not to unconditionally bar its exemplars from membership in the ranks of the first kind of art. But there is something that bothers me when comparing a shonen manga, even an exemplary one, to the Iliad. Here is another typical passage depicting the heat of battle. It is long, but it makes the point very well. The henchmen of Idomeneus stripped the armor from Phaistos, while Menelaus, son of Atreus, killed with the sharp spear Strophius' son, a man of wisdom in the chase, Scamandrios, the fine huntsman of beasts. Artemis herself had taught him to strike down every wild thing that grows in the mountain forest. Yet Artemis of the showering arrows could not now help him. No, nor the long spear casts in which he had been preeminent, but Menelaus, the spear-famed son of Atreus, stabbed him, as he fled away before him, in the back with a spear thrust between the shoulders, and driven through to the chest beyond it. He dropped forward on his face, and his armor clattered upon him. Meriones in turn killed Pericleos, son of Harmonides, the smith, who understood how to make with his hand all intricate things, since above all others Pallas Athena had loved him. He it was who had built for Alexandros the balanced ships, the beginning of the evil fatal to the other Trojans and to him, since he knew nothing of the gods' plans. This man Meriones pursued, and overtaking him struck in the right buttock, and the spearhead drove straight on, and passing under the bone went into the bladder. He dropped, screaming, to his knees, and death was a mist about him. Meges in turn killed Pedaios, the son of Antenor, who, bastard though he was nursed by lovely Theano with close care, as for her own children to pleasure her husband. Now the son of Phileos, the spear-famed, closing upon him, struck him with the sharp spear behind the head at the tendon, and straight on through the teeth and under the tongue cut the bronze blade, and he dropped in the dust, gripping in his teeth the cold bronze. Eurypylos, Euaemon's son, killed brilliant Hypsenor, son of high-hearted Dolopion, he who was made Scamandros priest and was honored about the countryside as a god is. This man, Eurypylos, the shining son of Euaemon, running in chase as he fled before him, struck in the shoulder with a blow swept from the sword and cut the arm's weight from him, so that the arm dropped bleeding to the ground, and the red death and destiny the powerful took hold of both eyes. You can tell who the heroes are: Menelaos, Meriones, Eurypylos. They're the ones doing the killing. Those who they kill are never mentioned before and never mentioned again. They are cannon fodder. But notice, just as Homer describes the brutal victories of his heroes, he immediately follows it with information about the pitiful nobodies who lie in the dust. They too were favored by certain gods. They too possessed skill and talent. They too were cherished by those who loved them. They will not meet again. They die screaming. In the Iliad, even though the heroes are the center of attention, Homer always forces his audience to hear the anguished cries of the average foot soldier. He never lets us forget that the whole venture is foolish, that no one ought to be there in the first place, and that nothing is worth the price of death. The inherited will of the Greeks is a senseless path of shredded tendons, red mist, and impaled bladders. There is no romance in combat. There is only death, and the dreadful tears of those left behind. So, while the presence of fighting does not seem like a reason to exclude the shonen genre writ large from the first world of art, I also do not think that this is where we are going to find any deep truth. It might seem like I am being unusually hard on One Piece, and you're right. This video is not intended to prove to the viewer that he or she in fact has good taste, despite reading a book for children. But I do hope to reach a satisfactory conclusion in the end. The gratitude which I expressed during the introduction to this video was not hand-wavy flattery. I am extremely grateful to everyone who has made it this far, and I hope to make the journey to the end worth your while. The fact of the matter is, like you, I love this silly kids show, and I want to take seriously the idea that it could be more than a good manga or a good fantasy, but a good work of art in the most elevated sense. This video is an attempt to take that idea more seriously than I think it has ever been taken. And this also means that I feel compelled to demonstrate why I believe the usual attempts do not succeed. This also means demonstrating why the typical anime fan might come to expect them to do something that they cannot. Nothing is wrong with pop philosophy or literary analysis in themselves. They are fun both to watch and to make. The problem arises when they are expected to do something which they are not equipped to do, to justify the fan's love of the genre to herself by proving that the strong emotional response which the fan has to any given series is somehow necessary, and therefore no different than the response of someone confronted with a truly great work of art. I have tried to show that these other attempts are based on the presumption that art is subjective, that its sole purpose is to produce feelings. The objective of this video is different: to see if a piece of popular media can stand up to the highest standards of literary criticism. Most popular media won't make the cut, but I want to believe that One Piece can. There is really only one other set of reasons offered up in support of One Piece's quality that we should find problematic. One Piece's author has a real genius for pulling design inspiration from characters and locations from other works of literature, or from popular media, and reproducing them effortlessly within the story's world. It is one of the hallmarks of his world building, and an aspect of the manga which gives it a unique cosmopolitan charm in relation to other members of the shonen genre. Far from being obtrusive references shoehorned into the world for culture points, each looks as if it could just as well have emerged organically from out of the world itself. Pragmatically, of course, drawing inspiration from a wealth of different sources allows locations in the story's world to differentiate themselves from each other in the same way that their counterparts in our own world do. But the elegance with which it is done, how each location and character comes alive as if it emerged from out of the fictional world itself, demonstrates a real synthetic genius on the part of the author. And yet, the many references of One Piece stop at the level of pictorial reproduction. They only go skin deep. It's not clear what relation Enel has to Eminem, or what relation this member of the Five Elder Stars has to Gandhi. He's obviously not a pacifist, and certainly no friend to the oppressed masses. He just happens to look like him. If One Piece's author had chosen to draw Gandhi as a different Elder Star, or as a pirate captain in Whitebeard's fleet, or a merchant in Loguetown, it wouldn't make any difference. The same can be said about his portrayal of locations. Impel Down is rather obviously based on Hell from Dante's Inferno, but its exterior design and the fact that it has levels are the only commonalities it shares with Dante's Hell. This is, frankly, a missed opportunity. Hell in Dante's Inferno is structured by the type of sin which dominated the condemned's life, and the punishments at each level are fitted to that sin accordingly. The souls of those in hell for the sin of lust, for example, are pummeled constantly back and forth by strong winds, unable to ever escape the storm and find rest. This is punishment for the fact that, in life, they were unceasingly driven around by their unreasoning appetites. The levels of Impel Down, on the other hand, only correspond to bounty, and the unique characteristics of each level have nothing to do with what the prisoners are there for. The references and sources of design inspiration in One Piece, unfortunately, seem to demonstrate little more than the author's familiarity with the Wikipedia search function. Deep references do more than simply replicate the source material within a new medium. They also enter into a conversation with it. For example, in the prologue of Goethe's Faust, the devil, Mephistopheles, makes a bet with God that he can tempt the titular Faust away from the plan God has for him. This is obviously a reference to the book of Job in the Old Testament, in which the devil makes a bet with God that he can bring Job to curse God to his face, so long as he is allowed to deprive Job of his many possessions and loved ones, which allow him to live a blessed and happy life. But something is immediately and obviously wrong as soon as we meet Faust in the next scene. Far from living a blessed life, full of faith and surrounded by a happy family, Faust is already alone and miserable. Far from possessing a strong faith in God, Faust seems to have lost it. He's a solitary scholar who has studied every academic discipline of his day to its very end, and finds himself at the end of his journey with nothing to show for it. Having exhausted every serious field of study, he turns in this first scene to magic, and, to his surprise, summons a spirit. But the spirit, apparently unimpressed with Faust, disappears, and Faust, having lost his lifeline to, well, something further after which to strive, attempts to take his own life before being interrupted by the ringing of church bells on Easter morning. If Job is the ideal existence of his time, a pious man with a large family and many cattle, Faust is very much so the ideal of ours. The pursuer of knowledge for its own sake, without any regard for fame and fortune, and more generally the one who keeps striving ever onwards. Faust is in many ways the modern ideal, portrayed in its multi-toned contortions. His rapid oscillation from hope to despair, and from attempted suicide to serene contemplation seems ludicrous, until we remember that these swings of dramatically elevated states of sentiment are a defining feature of modern experience. Far from serving as a fun little Easter egg for readers of the Old Testament, Goethe deploys the framing of the Job story to play with the whole nexus of issues at stake in it, importing them into a world, our world, where the existential ideals are radically different. What would it even mean for the devil to tempt someone who had no need of tempting? Are the old modes of theological justification, that God has a plan, serviceable in the case of the modern subject who, far from relying on the plan of a divinity or anyone else, is supposed to build himself, work on himself, and strive ever onwards? Even if that modern subject, in a complete reversal of the Job story, received all of the conditions for his own satisfaction, would he ever be satisfied? And that, more or less, is what Mephistopheles does. He doesn't take away Faust's possessions. He is a diabolical figure because he gives Faust exactly what he wants. These, among many others, are precisely the sorts of questions that Goethe's Faust reckons with. References within the first world of art are never merely Easter eggs or museum pieces. They are conversations between the referrer and its referent. In this respect, unfortunately, One Piece seems to fall short. I'm not sure where we go from here. This video has spent the last hour, with much hesitation and apologizing, tearing down the reasons fans give for their love of One Piece. When I began, I had hoped that something would emerge from this exercise. But at this point, I feel that the tone of the video has become too critical, and a mode of criticism which takes too much pride in its negative critical powers will demolish even the most beautiful works of art. While we set out hoping to thread a path between the Charybdis of vulgar aesthetic nihilism and the Scylla of blue-blooded aesthetic elitism, I worry that we have, in fact, managed to fall into the clutches of both. There is a time-honored literary convention whereby an author puts an opinion or attitude in the mouth of another. Plato is maybe the most famous for this, choosing to put arguments in the mouth of Socrates and his interlocutors, rather than advancing any straightforward argument of his own. But really you can find it all over the philosophical canon, from Diderot's posthumously published dialogues to Kierkegaard's pseudonymous works. I am tempted to do the same. For us, I think it will be a way of hitting the reset button. So instead of trying to build a conclusion from what we've already said, let's imagine that we've discovered a famous One Piece critic. Let's imagine that he's figured it all out, and has written more than a dozen scholarly volumes on One Piece with titles like From Aeschylus to Oda, a genealogy of the mythic imaginary, Gods Where We Ought Not Step Foot, a theologico-psychoanalytic conception of kingship in One Piece, and Breaking Waves, Arlong Park's laistic theory of personal autonomy. Let's imagine that, through his groundbreaking research, he inaugurated a new academic discipline. Undergraduates at Harvard are now taking classes on the basis of his work. His name is, of course, Euphrates. He will be everything a groundbreaking critic ought to be. Bold, unflinching, and speculative. He carries himself with the voluptuous self-assurance of one who has never believed himself to be wrong, and one to whom the world has never given a good reason for thinking otherwise. He loves verbal jousting matches, has never apologized, and speaks 7 languages, including medieval Japanese. 2 years ago, one of his altercations with a fan at an anime convention went viral. He was sitting on a One Piece panel with Mayumi Tanaka and Mark Jobst when, during the Q&A, a lanky member of the audience with matted hair asked him if he thought trying to analyze One Piece as an academic was kind of cringe. Euphrates pretended like he didn't hear the question the first time, and forced the kid to stutter his question into the microphone again. This time, there was no mistaking that he heard it. "Cringe?" he shouted, jolting up from his chair. "I'll show you cringe!" As he proceeded to unclasp his double XL pinstripe button-up, tear the undershirt from his lumpy torso, and, turning around, reveal Whitebeard's Jolly Roger emblazoned in dark ink across his back. This is our man. And here he comes, warming up his powers of critical imagination on a piece of early 2000s symphonic power metal. It begins overproduced. The composition begins epic, but an epic cannot begin as an epic. That is a designation it must first achieve. The pulsing beat of strings and chorus comes unearned. Like a child flapping around in his father's suit jacket, we attempt to fly before we know the meaning of wings. A Disney villain makes his appearance. That is the mood of the first movement. More layers are added. The swell is too exaggerated, even for Disney, which always preserves a careful self-awareness in even its most dramatic productions, and fears most of all being laughed at. These are the crashing steps of the proudest of mortals, who satirizes himself with every footfall, who takes possession of the earth with a glance and rejects the claim of all other eyes. His leaden hubris awakens the underworld deities dormant beneath his feet. The old gods stir, blink at each other with ponderous eyes, and look above at the proudest of mortals who roused them from their slumber. The chthonic chorus erupts in indignation. The bedrock quivers, groans, and howls. The proudest of mortals stumbles and tears his glance from the gaping maw of the earth. But he does not close his eyes. The ruling orders of the heavens hear the cries sent up by the wailing stones of the earth, and deploy their counterforce. The heavenly host streams from the seams of the firmament to quell the awoken divinities. Now, where have we arrived? We see a life blanket the earth, the tranquil onslaught of reason imposing order on restless appetite. We see the rejection of mundane desire and the possibility of kinship with the divine. The proudest of mortals brings himself to his feet. He sees nothing of the sort. The mountains crumble around him. The pillars of the forest are split asunder. In dread confusion they fall and crash, one upon the other, and through the chasms of the wreckage the winds hiss and howl. The proudest of mortals rushes from the disorder and throws himself headlong onto any path spared the devastation. Only now, 2 minutes and 30 seconds into the song, we are confronted with the chorus. The proudest of mortals, for the first time in his life, has a goal. He has a purpose drawn from a growing awareness of his own mortality. We see him careening, wide-eyed, this way and that, coerced to pathways by forces beyond his control, his possibilities increasingly restricted by the world crumbling around him and the choices he made in the past. Despite his striving, he is pursued by the premonition that all paths ultimately lead to the same end. The lyrics of the song are, quite famously, difficult to understand. This is because they are utterly unimportant. They exist only to carry the music, and whatever ideas the librettist hoped to express are appropriately incinerated in the totality of the movement. More careening. He has learned to place every hurried step in this sprint with equal parts caution and haste. He cannot afford to trip, and he cannot afford to slow down. But after a life of running, his legs begin to fail. His eyelids begin to fall shut, and he sees at the end of the path a break in the thicket, a light reflecting off the surface of the sea beyond the bramble. He closes his eyes and throws himself headlong through the final trial of the forest. The proudest of mortals feels his hands and knees resting on soft sand. Water rises and falls against his wrists. He opens his eyes, and for the first time he sees himself. He takes possession of the knowledge of good and evil, and looks upon himself in reverent shame. The song begins once more from the top. What have we just heard? Why, nothing less than the coming to self-consciousness of one who is already in himself self-conscious. The interweaving of the so-called luck of the draw, which rests at the basis of any existence bounded by death, the reality nonetheless of reason and order, and the terrifying situation of the one who is forced to play the role of buffer state between these antagonistic superpowers. All of this is found in the interleaving of the musical themes corresponding to what I have identified as the underworld deities, the ruling orders of the heavens, and the proudest of all mortals, respectively. The last of these is introduced first, the first of these introduced second, and the second of these introduced last. The crushing tones of the underworld deities are, accordingly, rarely present without the accompanying theme of the proudest mortal. It is only because one can look upon the apparent apathy of the universe towards mortal beings that it appears as apathy, as something destructive at all. The theme corresponding to the ruling orders of the heavens, on the other hand, demonstrates greater autonomy, as it would be expected to, being the autonomy of reason over and against any matter of contingent luck. The unity of all three, their inherence in man, finds its most perfect representation in the chorus, which, as we noted, only comes into being more than halfway through the song. If the composition can be said to make an argument, it is the following: that something about the ever-present reality of death, coupled with one's participation in reason, spurs the unique being which shares of both to both self-consciousness and shame. If the final moment is a metaphor for dying, it is not dying in the literal sense, but in the metaphorical. The proudest of mortals is born again. He comes to an awareness of himself, and he sees that he is naked. His pride perishes in his self-consciousness, and he can now listen to the song for the first time. So he will, of course, feel ashamed at the booming, unself-conscious pride which initiates the song, and, with us, will be able to observe the tragedy of the proudest of mortals afresh. Thus, the title of this lecture: Self-Referentiality as Structure in the Coming to Be of Self-Consciousness Against the Horizons of Death and Divinity in Nightwish's Planet Hell. Have no fear, that was only a warm-up. I will not partake of so many metaphorical flights of fancy in a serious critique, and will keep everything firmly grounded in the text. I will be the first to admit that, when it comes to music, I am an amateur. But when it comes to One Piece, I assure you, I am its only professional. You have asked me to present a lecture which might present this almighty work's membership among the ranks of the finest art. Of course, if you are really interested in this question, I would direct you to my books, to be found on the websites of their respective academic presses, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and so on. But it can never hurt, as it were, to take another stab at the thing, and compress my thoughts into a form more accessible to a general audience. In order to furnish the greatest possible proof in the shortest possible time, I will confine myself to the finest arc in the story, that of Skypiea. What if Skypiea were One Piece's very own internal metaphor or compressed image, with every moment of the island's history representing an analogous moment in the world of One Piece? If Skypiea, like the world beneath, was marked by three transformations. The first, the arrival of Verth and the Shandia, corresponding to the creation of the Red Line below and the primacy of the god of the land. The second, the arrival of Enel and his compatriots, corresponding to the creation of the current world government, the destruction of their previous homelands, and migration to higher ground, the squashing of dissent and creation of an uneasy peace through fear, and the primacy of the god of the sea, Sea and sky being, of course, structurally interchangeable, the sea of Skypiea is the sky. And the third, lastly, the end of the manga and the overthrow of the divine tyrant. If the Shandia, then, were a compressed image of the D clan and Kalgara an image of Joy Boy, who, like him, was unable to keep a promise to a friend due to circumstances outside of his control, and who, like Joy Boy, thus inadvertently condemned his friend to a pitiful fate, etc., etc. None of this would matter for our purposes, or rather, it would only be secondary to the basic drive of both stories. So let us begin with Skypiea. On the surface, the theme of the arc is that appearances can be deceiving. The entrance fee is not an entrance fee, which is an entrance fee. Enel is a god who is not a god. Gan is a guy who was a god but is no longer a god and who was also never a god. Sky Island is not an island, which is an island, which is not an island, but is an island, and is in fact the island the Straw Hat Pirates were looking for and not looking for, and so on. But I claim that, demonstrated in this arc, and by virtue of that demonstrated throughout the entire manga, is not the claim that appearances are deceiving, but rather that appearances are everything. What do I mean by this? Usually, we deploy the term appearance in a derogatory manner. An appearance is a mask or superficial covering which cloaks some hidden reality. If we say that someone is taken in by appearances, we mean that they engage with others superficially, and fail to penetrate to the core of their character. In the philosophical tradition, of course, Plato's allegory of the cave exemplifies this attitude toward appearances. The world of appearances, that is, the world of coming to be and passing away, which we perceive with our senses and believe to be the fullest reality, is really a shadow play. The truest reality is the world of forms, the eternal, unchanging essences of all things, which can only be grasped noetically. Underlying every single apple, human being, and beautiful thing are the forms of appleness, human beingness, and beauty respectively. There is a certain intuitive appeal to this approach because if there were not something like forms, it is not clear how we could compare apples to each other, much less to oranges. If you were to claim against Plato, for example, that we could in fact compare apples to apples on the basis of social convention or some set of shared qualities, he would perhaps reply something like this. What do you mean? You call an apple red, but there are many red things, and many apples which are not red. If you do manage to come up with a list of essential qualities, an achievement which I highly doubt, this is because you have already apprehended the things which ought to share those qualities as the same kind of thing. And as far as social convention is concerned, do you believe that the names which we give to things are arbitrary and that they come from nowhere? Not at all. If a group of people can give these same kind of things the same name, this is only possible because they have already apprehended the same kinds of things in the same sort of way. That convention is at all possible seems more likely to prove my point than yours. But let us put Plato to the side. I meant only to demonstrate how deep-seated the pejorative sense of appearance is, both colloquially and in the philosophical tradition. Let us return to Skypiea. In Skypiea, appearances are everything. Consider the entrance fee. The Straw Hat Pirates learn upon reaching Heaven's Gate that entrants to Skypiea must pay, by law, an entrance fee of 1 billion X-toll to enter. They do not know what an X-toll is, if it is convertible to berries, and if it is, what 1 billion X-toll would amount to. But when Nami claims that they don't have the funds, again not knowing how much 1 billion X-toll actually is, the gatekeeper mentions that they can still enter. The Straw Hats, of course, take her up on the offer and ascend to Skypiea. After they are on their way, the gatekeeper reports to the ruling powers of Skypiea that 7 travelers have entered illegally and are subject to judgment. So the entrance fee is not an entrance fee, which is an entrance fee. But what is being concealed here? What lurks beneath the mask of the appearance? Nothing at all. The truth of the matter, the verdict of judgment if one does not pay the entry fee, is utterly insignificant. Are we to expect that, if the Straw Hats had paid, they would not be subject to the same judgment anyway? Imagine that there were no entry fee, and that the Straw Hats could approach and disembark on Skypiea at will. The arc would proceed exactly as it does. Someone would go exploring, step on the Forbidden Island, and incur judgment anyway. There is no beneath of the appearance, no deeper meaning. We are presented purely with its play. Another example, the trial of the balls. Another case where appearances appear deceiving. The Straw Hat Pirates are forced to choose their path of punishment. Their choices are the trial of iron, the trial of the swamp, the trial of strings, and the trial of balls. The trial of balls sounds the easiest to clear. It doesn't sound like a trial at all, it sounds more like a playground. So that's what they choose. The trial of balls consists of a fight with the priest Satori in an artificial environment made up of floating ball-shaped clouds. The clouds look like the sort of thing that might be fun to play with, until a tropical snake pops out. Or the ball explodes. Or is full of arrows. Or is a crab. Or conceals a chorus of birds. And so on. Satori, too, is not what he appears, and despite his globular waist and string bean arms, proves adept both at avoiding attacks and inflicting damage. This forest, he claims, is named the Forest of Illusion. Everything is a deception. But let us deploy our counterfactual method once again. Imagine that the clouds concealing various traps were transparent, and that it were perfectly obvious what sort of trap would be sprung if the cloud was touched. Imagine that Satori were an agile-looking man with tremendous arms, and that his abilities were obvious from his appearance. Imagine that the trial of balls was instead named the trial of snakes, bombs, and birds. Would this have somehow dissuaded the Straw Hats from picking it? Would the transparency of the traps have prevented the Straw Hats from falling into them? Would the fight have proceeded in a different way if the Straw Hats knew from the beginning that Satori could dodge their attacks and damage a man made of rubber? I do not mean that the Straw Hats would have won regardless. Of course they would have. They are the heroes. I mean that every moment of the battle would have progressed in exactly the same way. Of course, as in the case of the entrance fee, deception is the intention. But the deception does not matter. One could just as easily have told the truth and arrived at the same result. Imagine that the gatekeeper told these Straw Hats that if they did not pay the entry fee, they would incur God's judgment. Do you think they would, upon hearing this information, be more likely to pay? Wouldn't it be the opposite? Wouldn't they be less likely? A deception might be intended, but the response to and the effect of the deception remains the same as if it were the unhidden truth. The deception is always innocent in its result, and this, I claim, demonstrates the primacy of appearance. It is not the appearances which are a shadow play before the eyes of the onlooker, but the intent or deeper purpose supposedly lying behind them. This play of appearances displays itself relentlessly over the course of the arc, from the playful and changing significance of the title God, to the Norland the Liar framing device, the liar who was not a liar, who it turns out was in fact a liar accidentally, to the City of Gold, which should be underwater but is actually in the sky, but is no longer a city of gold because it is a flying boat except for the part inside of a giant snake. It is not that there is one deeper reality underlying the story, but that everything is constantly flowing into everything else. The great moment of revelation, that Jaya is in fact the upper yard of Sky Island, occurs less than halfway through the arc, not at the end, as if the story were a murder mystery to be solved at the last moment by Hercule Poirot. The revelation is not a resolution of the play of appearances, the exposure of the man behind the curtain so that everyone can finally go home, but rather its continuity. The symphony continues. What do I mean by all this play of appearances? Why would this be an observation of any significance whatsoever? Because, I claim, it flouts the metaphysical assumptions of our thought. Consider the two great pre-Socratic philosophers, Anaximander and Heraclitus. Both attempt to reckon with the origin of what exists, that is, how it is that what exists can come to be and pass away as it quite obviously does. What is the first principle of this state of affairs? And if things are indeed passing away, why do more and more things continue to come to be and take their place? Take seriously the magnitude of this thought. You see all around you the perishing of things, but it is not utter chaos. You can recognize the things which perish as discrete entities. What keeps it all from perishing into nothingness? And what allows those things which exist to appear as discrete entities, that is, as things which we can properly call beings? Anaximander found his answer in the thought of unconditioned, eternal being. Unchanging, the sole being that truly can be said to be in the proper sense, and as such the being which can never possess definite qualities being precisely those which belong to the realm of that which comes to be and passes away. Nothing can be said of this eternal, unchanging, indeterminate being beyond the fact that it is the ground of all becoming. In other words, it can be defined only negatively. That which comes to be and passes away, then, ought to be understood as a falling away from this primal being. Positing this sort of primal being allows Anaximander to account for the fact that the beings which we are familiar with continue to come into being, despite passing away, because they have their origin and point of return in something eternal. But this discovery carries with it a moral implication. That which passes away does so because it has come to be, but it could only come to be by means of a falling away from primal being. Anaximander correspondingly thinks of coming to be as a debt incurred with respect to that original eternal being. Passing away is the payment of the debt. Existence itself is guilty, and passing away is the enactment of justice. This basic stance mirrors our usual metaphysical intuitions in two respects, though of course we can quibble about the details. The first, returning to Plato's allegory of the cave, is that there is some deeper reality behind the world of appearances, the world of becoming where things come to be and pass away. It does not matter if you call this a noumenon, or a mysterious force, which we have never observed and know nothing about except that we know it has to exist because other things exist. The second is that we are born guilty. It does not matter if you call this original sin or human rights, the human being is the being which must justify its existence. Along comes Heraclitus. Heraclitus too accepts the reality of the endless coming to be and passing away of things. But he refuses the necessity of an eternal primal being upon which the whole apparatus must rest. No, he says, rather than indicating deviations from that which truly is, coming to be and passing away is all there is. Heraclitus is famous for claiming that the basic element of existence is fire. Why fire? Because fire is always already on the way to another shape of existence. In other words, the one is the many. This discussion of these two pre-Socratic thinkers is indebted entirely to Nietzsche's philosophy in the tragic age of the Greeks, and there is no original interpretation of these thinkers being presented here. And here we ought to bring Nietzsche in explicitly. The many perceivable qualities are neither eternal substances nor phantasms of the senses. They are neither rigid autocratic being nor fleeting semblance flitting through human minds. Not autocratic being or arbitrary sense perceptions ground the primordiality of becoming for Heraclitus. What does? The world is the game Zeus plays, or, expressed more concretely, of the fire with itself. This is the only sense in which the one is at the same time the many. The game fire plays with itself. But why is this not flitting semblance? Nietzsche continues. In this world, only play as artists and children engage in it, exhibits coming to be and passing away, structuring and destroying, without any moral additive, in forever equal innocence. And as children and artists play, so plays the ever-living fire. It constructs and destroys, all in innocence. It builds towers of sand like a child at the seashore, piles them up and tramples them down. From time to time it starts the game anew, an instant of satiety, and again it is seized by its need, as the artist is seized by his need to create. Not hubris, but the ever self-renewing impulse to play calls new worlds into being. The child throws its toys away from time to time, and starts again in innocent caprice. But when it does, it combines and joins and forms its structures regularly, conforming to inner laws. Through the principle of play, of cosmic play, Heraclitus is able to account for both the apparent caprice of becoming and its unexpected concordance with inner laws. That is, things both come to be and pass away, and they do so in a basically orderly way, such that the discrete entities, cows, horses, rocks, etc., come into being. The world of appearance, the world of becoming, is all there is, but this does not entail that things are simply random, and far from requiring external justification, existence justifies itself in its very existence. Existence is innocent. Now we can return to Skypia. As I have claimed, the arc advances the view, insofar as it can be said that a work of fiction advances a view, that there is no deeper reality over and against the play of appearances. But this is not to say that these appearances are chaotic, like a hallucination. They are immanently ordered by their own internal laws. One of these internal laws, the internal laws governing the events of the arc, is precisely the rejection of any sense that there is a deeper meaning driving things. Indeed, the author presents us with attempts at deception, attempts to cover things up, and then demonstrates that these are utterly inconsequential. We might also point to the fact that attempts to impose external rules in this arc by means of signs and instructions are always ignored, as they usually are in the manga as a whole. So we are dealing with a work which itself is a work of play, and which reduplicates the principle of play, the rejection of any deeper meaning, as one of the internal laws governing the events which transpire within it. The ontological structure of the world is play. The spirit of One Piece, then, is quintessentially the spirit of innocence. The world is a world of play and requires no justification in itself. We need not point to the many examples where this spirit appears. There is no such thing as a sinful existence in itself. Anything which the reader might call justice in the world hinges on the rogue actions of a few Marines, and the protagonist Luffy is, of course, the very exemplification of childlike innocence. But let us return to Skypia. Skypia is unique in the fact that every person on the island is, in some sense, a foreigner. The Skypians migrated there from the moon. The Shandians were blasted there by the knock-up stream. The Burkans, led by Enel, arrived after he had destroyed their own homeland. The Straw Hat Pirates are, obviously, visitors. So we are presented with a strange circumstance, where the matter of political legitimacy is, and always has been, a matter of dispute since the arrival of the Shandians, who themselves did not choose to be there. One Piece often deals with questions of political legitimacy, but it usually defers to a will of the people model, where rulers are supported, deposed, and re-established on the basis of public sentiment. Both Crocodile in his unsuccessful coup and Doflamingo in his successful version of the same perpetrate their revolutions by deceiving the people, and convincing them that their rulers do not have their best interests at heart. The situation on Skypia is different. Political rule has always been an open question, with all sides attempting to close it through the use of force. Moreover, each party's claim is fundamentally based on innocence, but in each case, innocence of a different type. The first migrants to Skypia chose the island when it was empty. Their claim is innocent with respect to the fact that they had chosen a place for their own self-determination which was not occupied when they arrived. Theirs is an innocence of conscience. They freely weighed their options, chose the one which would not impact anyone else, and proudly take responsibility for it. We may call this the moral understanding of innocence. Innocence on the basis of a morally good intention, and the clear conscience which follows it. The Shandians, on the other hand, had no choice at all in the matter. Theirs is an innocence of fate. Their island was blown into the sky, and they found themselves competing for territory and political hegemony against their will. We may call this the empirical understanding of innocence. Innocence on the basis of the uncontrollability of all life's circumstances, that one cannot so much as budge the deterministic drive wheel at the heart of existence, and that therefore one cannot truthfully bear any responsibility. Enel's claim, in what may come as a surprise, is also based on innocence. His, like Luffy's, is the innocence of the child. Look at his introduction. He's a kid. He cartwheels through his most loyal followers to his lounging chair and picks up a piece of fruit. Why did he call them up to his throne room? Because he was bored. Why, at the end of the arc, does he attempt to destroy Skypiea? Because he wants to. He is like the child which builds towers of sand at the seashore, piles them up and tramples them down. We may call this the aesthetic understanding of innocence. Innocence which flies over the moral and empirical understandings which take or reject responsibility on the basis of one's choices, or lack thereof, and instead aligns itself with the God-artist nature, which rejects the very notion of responsibility and justifies the coming to be and passing away of the world as a ludic phenomenon. You thought the world as play would be fun and games for everyone? Not at all. It is only fun for the playing God. So then, we are confronted by three different claims to political legitimacy, each originating in a different kind of innocence. The Skypieans claim the innocence of conscience, based on the moral understanding of innocence. The Shandians claim the innocence of fate, based on the empirical understanding of innocence. And Enel claims the innocence of the child, based on the aesthetic understanding of innocence. He is just doing what is fun. How, then, are these claims arbitrated? The inner law of the world of One Piece has already dictated the result, or rather, the result reveals to us the inner law, namely that the aesthetic understanding of innocence bears the greatest legitimacy. This is a world where man-children eat fruits that give them lightning powers, and children eat gum-gum fruits that give them rubber powers. The collision between the Skypiean and the Shandian claims happens in the past. We do not see them, and cannot see them, and we should not expect to see them. One Piece, like all shonen battle manga, cannot depict 400 years of war and negotiation. Gritty political reality cannot be depicted in a genre defined by comic exaggeration and superpowered individuals, and any attempt to do so becomes unintentional satire. One Piece's author recognizes that, given the basic inequalities between people presupposed by the genre itself, moralizing has no place, and nothing of moral interest can ever be said. The world he has created is structured by this insight. To say that the world of One Piece is a world of play is also to say that there is no deeper reality to which one can appeal and adjudicate moral claims. If a shonen manga artist attempts to shoehorn moral considerations into her work, if she has looked enviously upon the weighty moral quandaries presented by works of written literature, she has committed the crime of genre confusion, and does injustice both to morality and to innocent appearance. In the case of Skypiea, then, we should not be surprised that the individual possessing the greatest force ends up on top. But we should also not moralize this observation into the boring claim that justice is the will of the stronger, or that might makes right. This is a genre where moral claims have no hold, whether the claim is made on behalf of the weak or on behalf of the strong. If this appears unpersuasive, consider how Enel himself is defeated, not by someone stronger than him, not by someone who can destroy more islands and subjugate larger populations, but by someone who happens, entirely by chance, to be unaffected by his power. Enel, it turns out, is not the greatest god at play in the world of One Piece. It is here that I would like to invoke another of Nietzsche's works, The Birth of Tragedy, in particular with respect to what he calls the Apollonian. As you are doubtless aware, the Apollonian, for Nietzsche, is one of two basic, shall we say, patterns of apprehension and production, whose motifs appear together and mutually reinforce each other. The second of these is, of course, the Dionysian. These patterns appear most obviously in works of art, but Nietzsche will also maintain that they are definitive across ontological domains generally, for instance in that of politics. We will have occasion for exploring these implications in a moment. The Apollonian and Dionysian artistic drives, as Nietzsche calls them, were instantiated in and definitive for the classical Greek culture from which they draw their names. But this does not prevent their designating more universal impulses as well. As usual, we find ourselves indebted to the Greeks for even the concepts most apt to understand our own era, and whose ancient origin does nothing to dull their applicatory sharpness. Going into the specifics here will help us make sense of what has been said. For our purposes, two motifs, or characteristics of the Apollonian impulse, stand out as essential. The first is the origin of the artistic influence, that is, the type of experience from which the artist first draws his inspiration. With respect to the Apollonian, says Nietzsche, this is the experience of dreaming. In the dream, the dreamer enjoys the sheer pleasure of visual experience. She delights in the promenade of images which parade before her eyes. The parade is accompanied by the feeling of complete intelligibility. That is, to the dreamer within the dream, everything somehow makes sense, even if reflection upon awakening reveals the events to be absurd. To the artist, the dream seems like a more perfect vision of the reality that is lived while she is awake. The Apollonian artist aims to reproduce the same pleasure in images as that experienced in dream. Reproduce it in what? Now we arrive at the second motif contained in Nietzsche's concept of the Apollonian. This second motif is the structure of artistic production. For example, whether it is structured as a continuous entity, as in the case of music, where all notes flow together in a single experience, or in terms of discrete entities, as it is in the case of sculpture and epic poetry. Based on what we have said with respect to dreams, you might be able to guess on which side of this equation the Apollonian falls. It falls on the side of sculpture and epic poetry, the arts which bring forth images before the eyes of the audience. These forms of art are structured according to the principle of individuation, whereby characters and events are clearly distinguished from each other. The hero Achilles is not Hector, and the death of Hector is not the death of Patroclus, and we can list out all the details distinguishing the two. So you can see why Nietzsche unifies these distinct motifs under a single heading. The original influence which spurs the artist to create, the experience of dreaming, is inherently connected with the shape the artwork ends up taking, sculpture or epic poetry. More broadly speaking, then, the Apollonian is the domain of discrete intelligibility, the domain of imposing order, measure, and limits. It may come as no surprise that Nietzsche identifies the Homeric epics as Apollonian works of art par excellence. Even if the Homeric rhapsode could not directly present his audience with images like the sculptor, he does so with his words, which we note also present with a discrete intelligibility. Now we can understand why Nietzsche saw fit to bestow it with this name. For the Greeks, Apollo, the god of the sun whose light distinguishes individual objects, is also the god of dreams. However, as such, the domain of Apollo is also the domain of illusion. The images are too perfect, too intelligible, and too defined for our crude and messy reality. That is, the Apollonian presents us with an image which is too perfect, too stable, and too individuated with respect to the deeper reality of the world considered as play. It is as if the Apollonian artist, noticing the collapsing sandcastle of the playing god, draped a picture of the Taj Mahal over it. That is the Apollonian. We have argued that Enel's claim to political legitimacy rests on his particular shape of innocence. He is a child, the powerful sky god child, the greatest child in the sky, who ought to be able to play with his toys as he wants. But note the shape of his play. All play, we should remember, must proceed according to its own internal laws. It is inherently ordered, even if that order is not readily apparent. But Enel's play demonstrates a distinctly Apollonian tendency in the sense that it puts up a veneer of perfection and deploys a standard against which no one could measure up. Far from a spontaneous, self-creating order, he inherits the power structures which were already in place when he arrived. He calls himself God, and childly exaggerates their requirements. Certain lands become forbidden, and certain ways of speaking are outlawed. Through his claim to innocence, he makes all else uninnocent. Existence again becomes a debt, a guilt, and it becomes possible to sin against the god. He is not really a god of play, but a god which once again imposes normative rules and demands that beings justify their existence. The god-child of the sky, overproud in his individual existence, has confused himself with the god Apollo. So it is only fitting that the greatest child in the sky is confronted by the greatest child on the sea, a child who also builds himself a flying boat to go visit the fairy tale land in the sky. Indeed, much more than being Enel's natural enemy, Luffy is his inverse image. Where the Apollonian appears, the Dionysian is never far behind. Reverse the qualities of the Apollonian pattern that we listed above, and we will reach the Dionysian. If the Apollonian artistic impulse originates in the experience of dreaming, the Dionysian originates in the experience of intoxication in the grand sense, the feeling of the groundswell of the world and the oneness of all things in the rush of becoming. The world is experienced, is felt, as play. If the Apollonian structure of art distinguishes distinct entities in the shapes of sculpture and epic poetry, the Dionysian allows the whole to flow together in the unbroken, continuous shapes of music and dance. And if the Apollonian displays perfect illusions before a passively observing audience, the Dionysian has no audience at all. Everyone participates in the work of art, becomes the work of art, and in doing so experiences the primal truth that the world is, at bottom, an aesthetic phenomenon, the playful construction and demolition of the world of individuality. Dionysus is not the god of chaos, but the god of intoxication, and the god of unity in song and dance, that absolute elasticity into which all single individuals are dissolved. If this all sounds like the experience one might have at a drug-infused orgy, you have understood the Dionysian in its original historical form. All of this sounds fantastic, until one remembers that every intoxicated state comes with its own hangover. That feeling of oneness, experiencing the truth of the world as aesthetic play with one's very body, reflection on that experience sours it after the fact. The reveler faces her utter insignificance, the fact that, as a single individual, she is subject to the play of a god who is not the slightest bit concerned about her own individual existence. For the individual, the truth of the world as the playful construction and demolition of the world of individuality is both terrifying and abominable, and results in a depressive attitude towards life. So, is Luffy a Dionysian figure? Does One Piece present us with some sort of interaction between the Apollonian and Dionysian? Let's not be overly hasty here, and let's not be too quick to manhandle the story into clothes that may not fit. For Nietzsche, the Apollonian and Dionysian drives are perfectly unified in the phenomenon of Greek tragedy. The truth of the Dionysiac is cast in a multimodal unification of music and dance with image and word. Tragedy is the Apollonian objectification of Dionysiac truth. The tragic chorus in song and dance infects the mood of the audience with Dionysiac excitement. But as the audience is on the brink of becoming a writhing orgiastic mass, the tragic hero appears on the stage. It is as if their ecstasy itself summoned him. And what does the hero, a discreetly intelligible and speaking and so Apollonian figure, speak and undergo? The very truth which the audience feels, that the individual is an illusion, that all is one in the flow of becoming. So when the hero demonstrates that truth, when the hero is crushed and negated and destroyed, the audience experiences this as something which ought to happen, as something justified. They see the Apollonian individual through the eyes of Dionysus. They see it. Recall that vision is the mode of apprehension which comprehends phenomena as intelligible. The terrible truth, for the first time, becomes intelligible. It makes sense. In seeing this occur, rather than experiencing it exclusively in the feeling of intoxication, the crushing of the individual becomes a cause for delight as the audience finds that it can identify with the standpoint of the truth. It is possible for the individual to be reconciled with the innocently beating heart of the world. Tragedy can release us from the greedy urge for this existence, and remind us with a warning hand that there is another being and a higher delight, for which the fighting hero is preparing himself, prophetically, not by his victories but by his destruction. The results of this sort of attitude towards life, which takes the Dionysian truth as cause for creativity and courage rather than resignation, speak for themselves in the deeds of the Greeks during the tragic age. Readers of The Birth of Tragedy tend to forget that Nietzsche's analysis precludes them from experiencing the tragic when they pick up a copy of Oedipus at the local library. Without the music, without the dancing chorus, without one's fellow members of the audience, one experiences, at most, the incorruptible carcass of Dionysus, exhumed by grave robbers and classical philologists. Similarly, One Piece cannot, at least in terms of the way we experience it, at all resemble the full flowering of the Apollonian and the Dionysian. We are reading a comic book. Our aesthetic experience is entirely visual. The text presents us with an Apollonian image. The images of music and dance are just that, images, and it would be a gross confusion to presume that the mere visual depiction of music could excite these same sort of energies which Nietzsche assigns to the Dionysian. Be that as it may, there remains hope that, at the level of representation, if not that of aesthetic experience, Luffy might be a Dionysian figure. Is he? Obviously. He is a figure who breaks down barriers, who asks after no justice, whose own innocence extends also to his attitude towards others. He is a figure who is relentlessly active, a figure who sings and dances. Even the boundaries of his own body are in flux. But he is also a cartoon. He exists in the domain under which Apollo exerts the most control. Homer made do with words to show us what he saw. The manga artist needs no intermediary. We cannot experience the unity of the Apollonian and the Dionysian as the Greeks did in their tragedy, but Luffy can. Lo and behold, the partying pirate is also the sun god. Dionysus is unified with Apollo. Luffy knows what the tragic spectator, what the ancient Greek knows. Hopefully, now the purpose of our many digressions has become clear. If Luffy were merely an agent of liberation, which we labeled Dionysian, in a world ruled by a cruel regime, which we labeled Apollonian, this would be no cause for interest. We would miss both the significance of the comic artistic medium, as well as the ontology of the world as play, which the work reveals in its handling of events. Do not be fooled when weighty philosophical ideas are set upon feather pillows. They share none of their weight and serve only to crush the stuffing. One Piece discloses the world to the reader as play across a number of levels. We have already pointed to Skypiea as emblematic in this respect, insofar as its events display the internal laws and logic of the playing god, who cares little for intention and normative designations. The world is also a comic world, in both senses of the term, but first and foremost in the sense that it is one we receive visually. So it presents us the world as a play of appearances. That is the structure of the world, and for the reader there are no competing viewpoints. Does this reflect the ontology of our own world? Is the reader's world also a world of play? We cannot say. Maybe Anaximander got it right, but in the case of One Piece there is no question. This is not a fictional world where we must pretend that there are higher ordering powers which structure it, such as transcendent conceptions of goodness. As a result, the grounds for action within One Piece, the reason people do the things they do, can never be established according to eternal moral principles, as they can, for instance, in the Chronicles of Narnia. The world is play, and Luffy is the only one who recognizes this. There is no other way to solve the riddle of his complete character. His desire to continue living, and his indifference towards death, his easygoing attitude to danger, his belief in the basic innocence of things, his anger when enemies declare others guilty. This does not mean that he doesn't cry. Perhaps no people in history cried more than the Greeks. As the Egyptian priest tells us, they are eternal children. Let's put the point this way. The original Dionysian experience, the primal feeling of oneness achieved in orgiastic intoxication, reveals the truth of the world to the reveler, but is followed immediately by depression and resignation. Once the ecstatic experience ends, the reveler is faced with the insignificance of her own individual existence, and shuffles through life as a depressive for whom nothing matters. The tragic Dionysian experience, on the other hand, makes use of the Apollonian faculties of image-making, of making discreetly intelligible, to display the Dionysiac truth in an intelligible form. It appears in a shape that makes sense. The audience observes this truth, presented in the crushing of the individual hero on the stage, as something which ought to happen. It is something which they can reconcile themselves to. It is not that nothing matters, but that everything matters. The highest delight is affirmation of the play of the world. In this sense, the tragic Dionysian experience is a step removed from the original, but also somehow closer to it. The artistic faculties of Apollo are interposed between it and the audience, such that the terrible truth is elevated into a representation with which man can live. But in this experience, an experience brought about through the interplay of the Apollonian and the Dionysian, man, for the first time, finds himself reconciled to the truth. And in that sense, the truth itself becomes more truthful. One piece, I suggest, presents us with a second interposition of the Apollonian. If tragedy interposed the Apollonian between the audience and the Dionysiac truth, such that the audience sees the Dionysiac truth in the shape of the tragic hero on the stage, one piece interposes the Apollonian between the reader and the tragic spectator. We readers of One Piece do not see a tragic hero. We see a hero who is the tragic spectator, a member of the tragic audience, who knows the Dionysiac truth. This is why the work takes the shape of a comic book, the Apollonian medium par excellence. We see, therefore, a hero who dances and sings, a hero who behaves like a child in a world of play. We, the audience, do not dance and sing. We are not exposed to the Dionysiac truth, but rather to its result in a hero who knows it, and who plays in a world which expresses it. One of the more troublesome aspects of the Dionysiac truth, or the Heraclitean thesis, of the world as play, is what one ought to concretely do with it. Imagine that we have grasped it with our inmost being, and we affirm it as the tragic Greek did. What does this form of life look like? Activity is redeemed and saved from depressed resignation, but it is not clear what this activity ought to consist in. If there are no eternal moral laws, and if social convention finds no support in the ontological structure of the world, what should one strive for? What should one stand for and oppose? What ought one's purpose be? If it is purely a matter of artistic self-creation, the sort of thing many read Nietzsche to advocate for, particularly his existentialist interpreters, what is to prevent a man-child like Enel from enacting his artistic plan upon the world? The Greeks of the tragic age may have achieved great things, and they may have lacked a conception of original sin, but they also obliterated each other, to speak nothing of their designating all non-Greeks barbarians. If the world is recognized as play, are the majority of mortals condemned to watch helplessly from the sidelines as self-overcoming artistic power wills battle it out? This is the view that many so-called right-wing interpreters of Nietzsche put forward. I suggest that it is these implications, and this view, all too common, which One Piece, in putting forward a tragic spectator as a hero in a world of play, prompts us to rethink. Maybe it is the case that the views of the existentialist Nietzsche, and the right-wing Nietzsche, and even the tragic Greeks, forget what childlike innocence really looks like. Because if the ground of the world is the eternal and innocent coming to be and passing away of things, and if this is fully grasped and understood, by virtue of what possible reason could one designate others as barbarians? This is a bestowal of guilt, the imposition of a debt on the basis of one's birthplace which can never be repaid, or perhaps can only be repaid on the end of an Athenian spear point. Even if the Apollonian power of image-making was required for the Greeks to see the coming to be and passing away of the world as an ought, even if it permitted a people for the first time to look upon all that the child god made and say that it was very good, the Greeks remained, as it were, too politically bound to the hierarchies imposed by their Apollonian heritage. Even the development of the tragic drama served as a means by which they distinguished themselves from others. The truth which they experienced in the theater was converted into a courage deployed on behalf of whatever had already been decided politically. Similar can be said in the case of the self-creating life artist who eschews all activity which does not benefit himself, and justifies his indifference towards others with the mantra, "The individual is a lie." In both of these cases, it would appear, rather, that the truth of the Dionysian had not really sunk in. Does the child constructing sandcastles on the beach discriminate between the grains of sand? Wouldn't the effort of any individual grain of sand to lift itself above its peers be funny? Scholarship often operates under the assumption that, if one were to look for any sort of positive normative project to emerge from the tragic view of the world affirmed as play, we would need to look to the original tragic spectators, the Greeks, and observe what they did. I propose that this is a mistake. The essential factors determining what the Greeks did are muddled by the chance events of their history. The world into which the tragic spectator was thrown was always already structured according to Apollonian principles. The Greeks may, on Nietzsche's view, have drawn a resolute and joyous attitude from the experience of tragedy, but it is not clear in what way this attitude alone determined any positive criteria for action, even if the Greek found courage after looking into the innocently beating heart of becoming. The world in which he lived was a world of aristocracy and hierarchy, a world of boundaries and limits. Even if the truth of the world was the play of the god, they had already thrown too many images of the Taj Mahal over the godchild's sandcastles. Their pre-existing institutions foiled any possibility that action might be determined, rather than merely fueled, from truly Dionysian sources. And maybe this means that, when we attempt to articulate normative principles on the basis of Greek aesthetics, we forget that they too were imperfect with respect to putting knowledge into action, particularly when the political ramifications of that knowledge would destroy them. Imagine if a Greek captive were to propose that his captor release him on the basis of the fact that all coming to be and passing away is innocent. The uninnocent structure of the captor-captive relationship would almost certainly ensure that his captor would respond, "Right you are. So there will be no issue if you go and join your fellow slaves in the silver mines." But in the world of One Piece, Enel is defeated. Maybe the playing god at the heart of the world of One Piece had good reason for this. Or rather, not good reason, but was forced to this conclusion by his own internal law, the law which dictates that the play of appearances go on, and that the innocence of the child be made manifest. The world of One Piece is fictional. As such, it does not carry the baggage of a prior metaphysical view of the world which lingers in its institutions, nor squash the possibility of the full flowering of positive principles for action derived from the aesthetic ground of the world. The world is, to its bones, innocence, and this is why its author goes to such great lengths to demonstrate the basic playfulness of the world. Yes, there are dictatorships and subjugated peoples in the world of One Piece. The history of its world is full of these. But the power structures are such that an innocent child, fully harmonized with and reconciled to the play principle of the world, can demolish these like sandcastles on the beach. I want to suggest, then, that One Piece allows us to observe what the ideal tragic spectator would do in a world fit for their purest form of action, unadulterated by, for example, the historical accidents which make truly Dionysian principles for action impossible to identify in the case of the Greeks in their pure form. What sorts of positive principles for action, what sort of aesthetic normative project, then, does One Piece present us with? In closing, I would suggest 4. The rejection of guilt and those who impose guilt. Not, we note, the rejection of all hierarchy and order, Luffy is, after all, a captain. He never takes issue with hierarchy or political structure as such, and in fact tends to find it rather charming. He is not an anarchist. Instead, the innocent child hero takes issue with the designation of guilt, the assignment of guilt status. We note that this even extends to figures who reliable and upright characters consider worth imprisoning, as in the case of Loki. The rejection of all efforts to redeem the world. It needs no redemption. Another way of putting this is that the world does not need saving. Luffy is never interested in achieving political objectives. He brings them about accidentally. His deepest loyalties do not rest with a universal moral ideal like human rights, but rather with those closest to him, and those he has chosen to be close to. From the moral perspective, this smacks of arbitrariness, but from the Dionysian perspective, it is the affirmation of coincidence and fate, and the belief in their basic innocence. The invitation to participate in innocence. That the world is fundamentally innocent is not a private insight, nor is it one to be preached, as if it were a bit of argument which one might persuade others of through rhetoric. Preaching denies the innocence of the congregation. That they don't know becomes something they are guilty of, a guilt which can only be removed by adopting the viewpoint of the preacher. No, it is an insight to be demonstrated in action, whether in the rejection of guilt, or in the sheer wonder at the coming to be and passing away of things. The demonstration is an invitation. See, do as I do, and, if you like, come and explore the world. Innocence is not solely a private experience. It is a shared project, but a project which one can enter only innocently, like a child, learning how to play a game by mimicking another child. For the one who dies, death is comic. Not, of course, for his or her friends, but that one was a game piece in the world of play, that the world trundles on playing with or without one's being there, for all one's vanity, for all one's dreams, for all one's effort to become a really exemplary grain of sand. At the end of it all, the only proper response is laughter. More principles might be deduced, and issue might be taken with these four which I have presented. The primordiality of certain principles over and against others, particularly when they are presented in a concrete form, can always be quibbled over. What I wished to illustrate, rather, was merely that principles can be deduced, and we are justified if we understand these principles as Dionysian principles for action in their purest form. This view becomes available to us because One Piece has cast out the basis of alternative moralities which exist in our world. In its world, there is no hope for the ontological validity of our usual moral suspects. The world of One Piece is structured according to the Dionysiac truth that the world is play, and the innocent child hero who recognizes that truth plays within it. To the question of fighting, the objection that all genuine conflicts in One Piece are solved by physical combat, and so therefore can have no bearing for people like us, to this objection I have two responses. The first is that maybe the language of innocence in conflict is, at the end of the day, the language of fists, mano a mano. No clean, persuasive rhetoric, no strategy and deployment of foot soldiers as tools, but fists. Should we expect children to solve problems any other way? My second response is, you are absolutely right. We are allowed to watch, as if in a test tube, what can happen when Dionysian principles would be deployed as principles for action, and when these were justified and enabled according to the structuring ontology of the world as play. We don't need to worry about counter-arguments from convention and morality, because the world of One Piece is itself an aesthetic phenomenon. It is not our world. It cannot be our world. And trying to draw lessons from it is an exercise in foolishness. The occurrences and principles in this world can never be extrapolated to ours. We can only behold the innocent play of appearances and, perhaps from this experience, and this is the only lesson, learn to behold the innocent play in our own. You will never do as Luffy does, because you are not there dancing with him. Das ist seine Welt. Das heißt eine Welt.